Hello, everyone. How are you? If we can gather now. My name is Aaron Grizzell and Claiborne Carson. For those of you who didn't know, this dual personage. I want to share a brief story. At 10 o'clock this morning, received a call from Clay. If we can keep Clay in our thoughts and prayers, there are some tragedies that have happened very close to him, and he just very recently, and I mean very recently, and so he wishes to thank you all, because this is a location that he wants to be at every year. But he apologized that he just could not find his way to make it because of personal tragedy. So if we could all keep him in our thoughts and keep him in our prayers, I'm sure that he will catch them. In his place is an unworthy person. My name you already know. But we want to really make the stars of this forum the three people that we want to have a wonderful discussion about this idea of we're in this together in a couple of iterations. So we want to bring to the stage now our bishop, the Right Reverend Mark Handley Andrus, the Bishop of California. We can all give him a hand.
Thanks, Aaron.
Next we have Associate Professor of, is it Practical Theology? Ministerial Leadership and Practical Theology, and more so, she is a core doctoral fellow at the Graduate Theological Union. She holds 2 doctorate degrees amongst all of the other that she does. She was the 2017 keynote reflection speaker here at our Martin Luther King Jr. Evensong. She is the pastor of Faith Presbyterian Church. Amongst all of the other things that she does in academia, she is pastoring a church there in the East Bay. She is the Reverend Dr. Valerie Miles-Trimble. And next, as you all know, our keynote this year at Grace Cathedral, Andrea C. It will be coming to the stage. We're going to talk a bit about her. My iPad has no power. She has all of these. She is the new named chair of a new womanist chair at the Union Theological Seminary in the city of New York. She is the associate professor of theology and culture there at the Union Theological Seminary. She is the executive director of the Society for the Study of Black Religion. Last year, for those of you who were here and saw Charles Houston Long here with us, Charles Long founded that society some 50 years ago, and now Andrea is the executive director of that academic society. Amongst all of the other duties she has, she organized the funeral service for James Howell Cone at Riverside Church. She is a wonder in everything she does, and a preeminent scholar. Andrea C. White. So, why don't we start? And we want to do a couple of things. For us in the audience, you have 4x6 forms in your hand. If you have any questions, write those down. We will try. We can't promise, because if it gets good up here, then it's gonna, you know how it works. But if you would write those questions down, we will come by and pick them up. If we can't get to those questions, we will collate those questions and pass those questions along to each of the scholars here. All right? To each person here. they can reflect on them and see if we can't get some responses as we go forward. Is that okay? All right, thank you so much. Thank you so much. All right, so this year's theme is we are in this together. We're in this together. What I want to discuss is something a bit different. Our scholars here are. We want to take a slight twist here and talk about this idea of the other and how the other interprets and personifies this idea of we are in this together. Bishop Andrus is studying Thich Nhat Hanh and Dr. King in that idea. We have Dr. Miles-Trimble and Dr. Andrea White, reflective of the womanist tradition. And we want to spend some time digging into these two frameworks on the international side and on the womanist side to begin to help us to understand, one, what they mean, and two, how they are sort of tackled and interpreted within sort of the practical engagement of everyday life as we live it. So I want to start with Dr. White to sort of give us an idea of what a womanist reflective would be on this notion of we're in this together and that sort of meaning as you sort of see it and study it in your everyday framework.
Thanks, Aaron. Thank you for the opportunity to be here and to the NorCal MLK Foundation and to my colleagues, to the bishop, to my sister, Reverend Dr. Valerie Miles-Trimble, and to all of you for being here. So I want to begin with some remarks that I've prepared that will hopefully prime the pump for some conversation. I'm going to put King in conversation with the womanist tradition, which is anachronistic because King predates the womanist tradition. And I might just say, for those of you who don't know, womanist theology was born of identifying some lacunas, some gaps in what black theology was doing and what feminist theology was doing, especially in the 80s, in the 1980s. So it's a relatively young discipline, but in about the 1980s, some womanist scholars at Union Theological Seminary decided that black theology was attending to race, but it wasn't attending to gender. And then it noticed that feminist theology was attending to gender, but it wasn't attending to race. So womanist theology took on the task of attending to race and gender and class oppression. Wow. So womanist theology is, in my view, one of the more inclusive, holistic ways of approaching theological questions because it tries to address all of these and many others. In some way, it is the quintessential theology of otherness, I might say. Mm-hmm. So my remarks are putting King in conversation with womanist theology. And I might also say just one more thing about it. Womanist theology, depending on which womanist theologian you're talking to, some womanists will contend that womanism is very much about African American women's religious experience in the U.S., descendants of slaveocracy. Other womanists will argue that we're talking about women of color in the global context because there's something that women of color share in their experience globally. So that's a bit of a difference that's hopefully an invitation to read books in womanist theology, so you'll find out more. So we've been commissioned to give careful consideration to what it means to think king and faith together, and to lay those reflections upon the foundation of King's 1964 acceptance speech for the Nobel Peace Prize. Mm-hmm. And so I want you to hear King's opening remarks. I accept the Nobel Peace Prize at a moment when 22 million Negroes of the United States of America are engaged in a creative battle to end the long night of racial injustice. I must ask why this prize is awarded to a movement which is beleaguered and committed to unrelenting struggle, to a movement which has not yet won the very peace and brotherhood which is the essence of the Nobel Prize. So why a prize for an unfinished project, for a race that has not been won? Why a prize for a beleaguered movement, an unrelenting struggle? Well, Alice Walker, the literary genius who unwittingly contributed to the origins of womanist theology when she defined womanism, she says, a womanist loves struggle. So can you hear it? Do you perceive the womanist moment here? Can you hear the resounding resonance with the womanist word? In Alice Walker's four-part psalm, she writes, a womanist loves music, loves dance, loves the moon, loves the spirit, loves love and food and roundness, loves struggle, loves the folk, loves herself regardless. I have a friend who tells me I'm going to title my next book Regardless, just because I like that word so much.
Great title.
It's a great title.
Great title.
Cornel West, the theologian and cultural critic, points out that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. has been Santa Clausified, tamed, and domesticated. You can hear Cornel West saying that, can't you? Sanitized and sterilized into a non-threatening and smiling old man with toys in his bags and forgiveness in his heart. So I want to follow the lead of Cornel West and present instead the radical king. And I want to show you how we misread King when we make him the warm, fuzzy advocate for beloved community, because he values nonviolence and love and community, and he calls suffering redemptive. But West shows us the meaning of a revolutionary love in King. And I'm going to radicalize Cornel West by adding a little Alice Walker to the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. Can we radicalize Cornel West? Well, maybe Alice Walker can. Anyone who knows King knows he had faith. School-age children can tell you he had faith, he had hope. But what do we make of his faith? How do we understand his hope through the lens of a womanist? Who is King when womanists are reading him? Well, Karen Guth, she's not a womanist, but she writes of the political theology of King in light of feminist and womanist traditions, and she states the obvious, and because it's obvious, let's put it on the table. She tells us what we already know when she says that King paid little attention to gender injustice. He spoke often of the triple evils of poverty, racism, and war, but never identified sexism as an equally pernicious evil. King struggled personally to treat female civil rights activists and other women as equals. Indeed, both feminist and womanist literature exhibit ambivalence toward King. If King stayed alive a little longer, if he had had more womanist encounters, I have faith that King would clearly see that his love of struggle entails the struggle with black women. For when we read King alongside the Womanist Project, we can see that his embrace of crisis-packed situations, when he speaks of his famous letter from Birmingham jail, this embrace of crisis that seeks to generate creative tension, is not only resonant with, but is enriched by womanist Monica Coleman and her theology of creative transformation. We know from Joanne Marie Terrell about the complexity of redemptive suffering that does not value suffering as a good in itself, but is only redemptive when we learn from the sacramental witness of black women's blood. We learn from womanist Katie Cannon about the womanist virtue ethic of redemptive self-love. And when King elevates the moderate white liberal as more dangerous than the racist white supremacist. This claim is undergirded by Michelle Alexander when she speaks of the violent genocidal myth of post-racial colorblindness. There is no doubt that reading King with womanist thinkers grants an expansiveness to King not achieved when reading him on his own. Mm-hmm. There are many opportunities here, but it is Alice Walker's insight to put together the words love and struggle that help us undomesticate King and foreground the depth of his radical faith. So when Alice Walker says a womanist loves struggle, it helps us understand what King called the vocation of agony. The prophetic character of King's faith means that King was able to look evil in the eye and still refuse to relinquish hope. And his was the agony of hope. The agony of hope, of course, is accompanied by the full cognizance that hope leaves you vulnerable, that hope comes with no guarantee of achieving that for which you hope, simply because you hope for it. King knew that hope is not about the guarantee of success or optimism or wishful thinking. So we may not like the rhetoric of prophetic revolutionaries, but in their apocalyptic images of impending judgment on structures of privilege and injustice, we actually encounter a more accurate depiction of the life and death struggles occurring in our world. More accurate, Kelly Brown Douglas tells us, than the depiction given by those who would like to preserve the myth of manifest destiny and earned white privilege and the grand narrative of American exceptionalism. So I will end there and allow you all to share your comments.
Well, thank you for that.
Thank you.
I want you to, Dr. Miles-Trimble, I'd like you to respond briefly to that, because I want us to enter into a conversation going forward in marrying what Bishop Mark is studying, particularly around this idea of pushing King and King's words further into the space, right? It's almost as if there is more in there that even King realizes. Remember, this is the 1960s, right? Mm-hmm. And it was a male-dominated framework, particularly in the tradition that he was brought up in, right? So that when he's saying something from a perspective, right, that of otherness, but he is in a space where even some of his words are othered, because there are women there, there are black women there, there are women of color that have to be brought in, that we as males back in that time did not necessarily account for the way that we should have. And so these powerful words that he has are now being interpreted and framed in a way that's almost like pulling King along to the space that he needed to be, right? Pulling him out of his, male dominance into the brighter array of reality. And that's something incredible. This is the civil rights sort of person that we hold, who needs to be critiqued in a way to bring everyone in. So I'd like you, Dr. Miles-Trimble, to talk. Sorry, I laid that on you. To talk about that a bit.
I'm smiling because my brother, first of all, my dear brother, Aaron Grizzell, knows that I rarely can tell him no. And then he also knows that I have been looking at this. We've been deliberating about this in many of our talks in the GTU as we try to frame and understand the legacy of Martin Luther King in light of this era that we're in that I call Black Lives Matter times. And so one of the things that I would like to say in thanking you and Bishop Andrus for having this is that I would like to think that Martin Luther King, first of all, had he lived, and with many of us in this point in time living longer lives, well into our hundreds, he might have, had he not been assassinated, likely been alive, and having, first of all, a partner like Coretta Scott King, who does not get a lot of press, but who was coming into her own awareness as a feminist. Again, remember back in the 60s, there was not the language around womanist thought, but she was coming into her own. She was actually restricted by him in going out on a more public basis, speaking like we've been used to seeing Michelle Obama speak. And then in addition to that, he had 2 daughters, in addition to his sons. So I would conjecture that had he lived, and those 3 women were coming into their own, that his sexism, which was a part of his acculturation of the day, definitely would have been challenged. And I would like to think that by this point in time, he would be out there with us womanists advocating for voice and place for women of color and for women in general. I think he would have learned the short-sightedness of his ways, so I'll start out with that. One of the things, though, that as we have this legacy and this wisdom that I want to dialogue with Andrea on is that King, as you said, has been sort of placed in this sort of commercialized, objectified docility. And really, sort of like when we Hallmarkicize Jesus Christ, you know, on the back of a card, and, you know, and rather than understanding the radical intentionality of his words and his thoughts. For me, one of the pieces that you've used, Aaron, as sort of a inspirational trope for your message on the website, and that I took a copy of and just really went through, is that to me just embodies the essence of King, is his letter from a Birmingham jail.
Right.
Now, let me just say that if you Google that or look it up, let me forewarn you that many of the versions of a letter from a Birmingham jail have been redacted and have been sanitized. You have to go to either one of his books with his original writings, or you have to go to the Stanford website. This was going to be my shout out to Dr. Clay, where his hand-typed full manuscript
That's right.
is there, because some things are being left out of that manuscript that I just want to point out. Brother Eric earlier emphasized, as in our theme, the connectedness of all of us, and I like how King uses, we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality tied in a single garment of destiny. But he goes on to unpack what he means by that. And I'd like to just touch on a couple of things from the letter. And I, being a practical theologian and a womanist scholar, we cannot do theology without also doing ethics. So I think looking at King's letter through a theoethical lens, you begin to see some of his theoethical arguments where he is pointing out the dichotomy of what we would like to feel comfortable with is our religious ethic and our religious morality. And he is pointing out the fallacy of hypocrisy in some of the stances we take. He is saying that by our silence, that is a political statement that we are taking. And so I love how he starts out this letter to these different religious leaders, saying you express a great deal of anxiety over our willingness to break laws. This is a legitimate concern. I love his art of Socratic argument. But then he says, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? The answer is found in the fact that there are two types of laws. There are just laws and there are unjust laws. And I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. He then goes on to talk about, let us turn to a more concrete example of just and unjust laws. An unjust law is a code that a majority inflicts on a minority that is not binding on itself. Again, pointing out the hypocrisy and going through and even using scripture as a bridging hermeneutic to challenge what I call the religiopolitics of not seeing ourselves as being complicit in what we either are quiet about or what we openly advocate in a way that does not get to the heart of disparity. Now, the other thing that that I love about King is that he opens this letter saying making some key points, and I just want to point out the terms. He says, you may ask why direct action, why sit-ins, why marches, and so forth. And as you hear this, I want you to think about what our young people have been doing in Black Lives Matter. Okay? He says, indeed, this is the purpose of direct action. Direct action is to raise tension. Direct action is to bring to the fore the disparities through constructive nonviolence. He also says that the purpose of direct action is to create a situation so crisis-packed that it will inevitably open the door to negotiation. And so he actually then says, I would rather be considered a radical. I would rather be considered someone who is exercising this direct action. And because he says history is the long and tragic story of the fact that privileged groups seldom give up their privileges voluntarily. So what I'm seeing in this writing and in this letter, it's speaking of a time in the 1960s, but yet it is speaking to us about the same things that we are going through, the same things that are challenging us, the same things that are calling us to direct action in 2019. Okay. And this issue of hopelessness, when he says in his letter that he wonders in his heart when he thinks about his 5-year-old son asking in agonizing pathos, Dad, why do white people treat colored people so mean? What happens when you have to drive cross country and find it necessary to sleep at night in the uncomfortable corners of your automobile because no motel will take you? We can fast forward to 2019 and says, what happens when suddenly we're grabbed from our homes as we're trying to get our kid to school and being deported? What happens when we want to build a wall around our cities instead of tearing down walls between each other? It sounds like King the prophet was already being used to give us the very words to articulate what we need to think about
Yes.
in this Black Lives Matter times. Now, I agree with my sister here that when King really gets going, both in his sermons and in this letter, he's talking about the rights of men. He's talking about elevating mankind. He is forgetting that the very architects of the movement that helped to mobilize and write the letters and make the calls and get the churches open and make sure that people understood where they were supposed to be instead of taking those buses were women. We also have to be mindful that even in the March on Washington, many don't know this, but it is now a historical fact because many feminists and women are writing about it. The women were not allowed to have a front place in that march. They had a side march, some many blocks over. Yes, there were some figureheads because they could sing and because they were head of the National Council of Negro Women. But the rest of the women were several blocks away, not allowed to be part of this march. So those are the critiques that we have. Those are the things that make the women's marches of today necessary to remind our beloved brothers that we're not taking a back seat and going several blocks over. These are the things that tell us that we're in this together. Therefore, we have to be together. We have to work together, but we also have to see each other.
That's right.
And hear each other. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for that. We're going to try to get in here. I want to talk. I want to marry this to the international side. Thich Nhat Hanh, the great leader, has something to say in this conversation regarding otherness, and then the basic facts of where we are, who and what we are as persons and people, and human beings. It's not even a reductionism. It's just a plain fact. We are here. We're here together. You can't survive alone, physically, emotionally, mentally. There has to be someone else, right? I mean, this is just stuff. So I'd like to, hopefully, if we have a few moments, I want Bishop Mark, I want you to talk about what you've been studying in that aspect, and then I want to see if we can't, in the moments we have, see how we can marry this idea together and see if there might be a morsel of something that can come out of this that is fresh and reviving, not just for you, but a place where we might be able to plant a marker to start some new ways of thinking and studying. So I'd like to see if what you can do with that. You're the bishop, so if you can do it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, more than a morsel. Fantastic. Really, really beautiful. Thank you. And Aaron, your spirit is just pulling us along. It's exciting. To this idea that both of you have been saying about the critique of and the forwarding, and could we say the perfecting or the completing of Dr. King's own being and his thoughts. In Vincent Harding's introduction to Where Do We Go From Here, there's an extraordinary statement that I just keep going back to, where he says, and this was published, it was republished the year that Barack Obama is first elected as our president. So Vincent Harding, whose daughter spoke here last year, and who was a mentor of mine, and we worked together, Vincent and I, he wrote that maybe there will be a moment, I'm not exactly quoting, when the best of Dr. King and the best of Barack Obama will meet each other and become something else that we need. Now, this is a metaphysical statement in my mind. That is, he's not talking just about ideas. He's talking about beings. Barack Obama, a living person. And I think he meant Martin Luther King, a living person. And that Martin had some growth beyond what we could see in his life, as I do, as you do, as we do, and that maybe Barack did too, and that they were going to grow together, and I think the womanist part is there. So bringing them forward. The we, so I added a still when I was upstairs. We're still in all this together. The we is an interesting question too. When the first time when he writes this so many times quoted idea about the garment of destiny and our web of mutuality, this first published version is to my knowledge, is the letter from the Birmingham jail, but it's not the last. One of the most famous comes in his last Christmas sermon in the Christmas before he's assassinated.
Yep,
and
67.
So this is what he wrote this time. Now, in between, I'd like to say he's become a world citizen. He's become a world citizen. And part of how he became a world citizen was becoming friends with Thich Nhat Hanh. And I'll say a word about that in a minute. So this is what he says this time. It really all boils down to this. All of life is interrelated. We are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied into a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. We are made to live together because of the interrelated structure of reality. Did you ever stop to think, now here's where he deviates from the 1963. Do you ever stop to think that you can't leave for your job in the morning without being dependent on most of the world? You get up in the morning and go to the bathroom and reach over for the sponge, and that's handed to you by a Pacific Islander. You reach for a bar of soap, and that's given to you at the hands of a Frenchman. And then you go into the kitchen and to drink your coffee for the morning, and that's poured into your cup by a South American. And maybe you want tea. That's poured into your cup by a Chinese person. Or maybe you're desirous of having cocoa for breakfast, and that's poured into your cup by a West African. And then you reach over for your toast, and that's given to you at the hands of an English-speaking farmer, not to mention the baker. And before you finish eating breakfast in the morning, you've depended on more than half the world. This is the way our universe is structured. So between the letter from the Birmingham jail and his last, well, almost last, he again brings this up at National Cathedral, and that is on the back of your bulletins, the structure of reality again, but almost the last, the penultimate published version of this statement. In between that, he got an open letter in 1965 from this Vietnamese Buddhist monk, Thich Nhat Hanh. Now, let me say a word about that. Thich Nhat Hanh wrote a book called Vietnam, Lotus in a Sea of Fire. And it was a book to help Americans. It was first published in Vietnam, but then it was republished in English in this country to help Americans who were at war with his country understand that they were fighting people. People like themselves. And how many of you all love public libraries? I am so crazy about public libraries. When I would get frustrated with the church back in Middleburg, not here, but back in Middleburg, Virginia, I would threaten to leave and get a master's of library science and become a librarian. And my children would say, "No, you're too much of a nerd as it is." But I really love libraries, and you find treasures in libraries. And in this public library, the main library here in San Francisco, I got my first copy, starting this study of Vietnam, Lotus in a Sea of Fire, and it is filled with annotations in people's passionate, handwritten responses. The whole inside fly cover is in the Vietnamese language, every inch of it covered. I have not had that translated yet, but inside, when he's making points about the humanity of Vietnam, you've got people Xing it out and saying agents of the CIA, all kinds of hate is in it. Remember the passion that was gripping our country around Vietnam. And this Buddhist Vietnamese monk writes a letter to an American Baptist black man, American. And he tries to explain to Dr. King why monks, women and men, the most recent had been a woman, had been immolating themselves in Vietnam. Why? What did it mean? And he said it did not mean suicide, as had been reported. Reporters all over the world said these monks were committing suicide. He said it does not mean suicide. When a monk or a nun in Vietnam takes their vows, they burn themselves to show commitment. And to burn yourself entirely is total commitment. It was witness. And that word, of course, in Greek is martyrdom. And Martin Luther King understood that. And that began a friendship between these two extremely different people who represented countries at bitter war with each other. And that was, I would say, the embodiment of this idea of interrelatedness. 6 years ago, Thich Nhat Hanh suffered a massive stroke. He can no longer speak. He's 92 now. He's gone home to Vietnam to die, happily. He's full of joy. But before this stroke happened, he said an extraordinary thing. He said, the day Martin King was murdered, I was in New York. I could not sleep. I could not eat. I made a deep vow to continue what Martin Luther King called the beloved community. And I have kept this vow to this day, he wrote. And I believe I have felt his support for all these years. Well, that's friendship that goes beyond the grave and beyond the boundaries of class or culture or religion or country. And I think this is how Martin Luther King and Thich Nhat Hanh began to transcend their smaller commitments and become committed to something that was not universal in an abstract sense, but universal in a human sense of all of life being connected together.
Wow, so this idea of personhood and friendship. This morning, Eric Williams spoke, curator of religion at the Smithsonian, spoke at the Fellowship Church there, and he talked about from the book of St. Mark, chapter 2, when you remember the story, the person was sick, couldn't get to where he needed to get get healed, so his friends went to the place and basically tore someone else's house's roof off to get their friend down at the feet of Jesus to be healed, right?
That's one of the most important stories in the gospel. Well done. Because then Jesus looks at them, not at the man, and says, your faith
That's right.
has made him well.
So this radical, so this idea of is a friend, how far are friends willing to go? This radical notion of friendship, right? What are you willing to do for your friend, right? So this idea of what are you willing to do for your friend? Are we willing to help our friend and help our friend in critiquing our friend?
Right.
In order to bring our friend where they need to be, because our friend has something that everyone needs, right? And that's something that's interesting to me when I reflect on womanist scholarship. Having the hard and arduous work of having to pull people to where they need to be to fulfill, to create wholeness in the human project, right? I'm telling you, you aren't whole when we aren't together. Andrea, can you sort of talk about it? We aren't going to be able to get into any questions today. I'm sorry. I want Andrea to talk about how, particularly at Union, how this pulling of the dialogue to create wholeness for all of us is worked through in the scholarship that you all are pioneering there.
Yeah. I wonder if I can look at that question from a different angle, just a bit,
Sure.
rather than speak for life at Union. Because one of the things that really interests me in the work of social justice and racism in the US is the extent to which racism is quotidian, everyday, ordinary, normal, like the ticking of a clock, we barely hear it anymore. That quotidian nature of racism leads to dead bodies on streets. And I think we can connect some dots here. And the work that King did with race and race in the US, how do we pick up that mantle and address the notion that we think, I mean, this really is, I live in a bit of a bubble at Union, so nobody at Union would ever say this. But this sentiment of the post-racial, I had a student say in a classroom of mine, not at Union, but another classroom. Please don't Google me to see where I've taught. He said, "Why are we still talking about racism when slavery was over so long ago?" That was my first semester of teaching, and I was pretty sure I had the wrong job. I was floored. But this blindness to the fact of racism, which leads to what is now in its nascent stages, but still sort of a hot topic, is whiteness studies, and the study of white privilege and then how the white gaze on blackness should not be yet another form of racism. So I'm also a little bit squeamish about whiteness studies. There's some work to be done, but I don't want to center whiteness in whiteness studies in the work that needs to be done. So yeah, I'm just twisting the angle of vision a bit. Sister Valerie.
You're thinking about, you
I
see
can-
how she
I
rubbed
see
her
it
nose
too.
like that? Yeah.
And I would love to hear questions as well. I want to put a plug for.
Yeah.
If we can, we're at 5:18. If we can do 2 questions following Rebecca Nessel.
Well, and Valerie,
Yeah.
we want to
And
hear, while the questions are coming forward.
Dad, yeah, no, Dr. Miles-Trimble, we want to
Okay.
we want to hear from you.
I want to rattle the cage a little bit because I love the Mark scripture. My womanist theoethics troubles the notion of friend. Because we do go above board for the comfortableness and familiarity of our friends, of our known entities.
Yep.
We use the scripture where Jesus gives the two greatest commandments: love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, mind, and spirit, and love your neighbor as yourself. We easily take that term neighbor and say that's the folks right in our homogenous community that we know, that are our friends, that I'm comfortable with. And yet we are challenged.
And that we go to church with.
And that we go to church with, yes. And yet we are challenged in this day and time to see each other. If we're truly going to be in this together, if we're truly going to be talking about beloved community, then that means understanding our connectedness beyond the safety of friends.
Well, that's why I think it's so stunning that Martin King and Thich Nhat Hanh become friends.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
These are not the expected friendships.
So it is, what I want to emphasize is we have to understand our relational
Yeah.
relatedness, our dependency on one another, the importance of looking at each other even if we're strangers and seeing the sacred in each other. That is the other thing is that beloved community does not come about without very difficult, tough work.
Almost every time he wrote about it, King, it was in the context of the other side of reconciliation.
Yes.
Yeah.
So he presumed a betrayal of the community that would require a reconciliation effort before you could reach a new iteration of the beloved community.
Exactly. And it is, for us in this Black Lives Matter times, it is difficult work. It is not just saying, I forgive you. It is really making an effort to understand and respect our differences, and yet still be able to find ways to hear each other and to work together. That's radical.
Yeah.
And that is something that we also must do intergenerationally.
Yes.
So let me ask you. Let me ask you this. Just in the womanist framework, we've been talking about womanism through our themed lens, which all of you have. We are in this together. But this sort of womanism has diverse perspectives, right?
Yes.
Can you briefly highlight some of what those diverse perspectives may look like that don't take necessarily King as a principle or as a launching point?
Yeah,
For
I always tell my students that we really shouldn't talk about womanist theology. We should always talk about womanist theologies in the plural. You have as many womanist theologies as there are womanist theologians. They're distinctive, and as I also tell my students, not all Black women cook fried chicken.
And not all
Or
Black
eat it.
women
Or
are
eat it, but particularly cook
right.
it.
And not all Black women
Right.
self-identify as womanists.
Right.
It is a confessional identity.
Yeah.
You have to understand what that means for you and take that on as an identity.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah.
Got
Thank
it.
you
Got
for
it.
that question, whoever.
That was Dr. Dorothy Saruta, who's a distinguished professor at San Francisco State University back there,
Thank you.
who sort of posed that. She wanted to make sure that that was very clear and clean. What are some practical ways, Bishop, we want to start with you. What are some practical ways of conveying Dr. King's network of mutuality to white Americans, angry males, to the angry? You saw it. You saw it, the Lincoln Memorial. You saw it.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that?
I really have no idea. In all honesty, I am, cheerfully confident as I sit upstairs, but not naive. When I look, I'll try to say something practical. I'm sitting next to the practical theologian. I am the impractical theologian. When I look at Donald Trump's approval rating staying at 39%, I fear for the literal safety of this country. I think that is very frightening to me. When I spoke at Temple Emmanuel as part of the anti-white supremacist response here in San Francisco a year and a half ago, I started by saying, I used to say this, his election and what has unfolded was a 1939 moment. And there were a lot of Jews in the synagogue, and they were all nodding yes. And I said, I don't think it is a 1939 moment, because there is a resistance that is so widespread and has learned from what happened in Germany and Poland and so on. But when I see that number, double digits of our country believing that as each enormity is unveiled, that they stay with him. It's confusing to me. So I'll say in a practical way, I say yes to all my critics. So when I was arrested protesting the Iraq War, there were a lot of people in the Diocese of California, Northern California, who thought that was super. But there were quite a lot of people in the United States and here in San Francisco who did not. And I made a point of only writing back to the people who were furious about it. Oh. And I met with some of them. And I have done that recently with some Episcopalians here in the diocese who did vote for Donald Trump and continue to support him. So we've had lunch together, and we've met in my office together. And that is the only way I see forward, is for me personally to be able to say, I will relate to you. I'm not apologizing. That doesn't mean I don't have things to apologize for, but I'm not making peace by saying, oh, I really didn't mean that. What I mean is I'm bringing myself into the conversation as respectfully as I know how, and acknowledging their personhood, and we have a real conversation. That's the only way I know to do it. It's slow, but we had a vigil upstairs here in Grace Cathedral after Proposition 8 passed. We were all bitterly disappointed. The leader of one of the anti-Prop 8 movements, a lesbian woman, a very famous lawyer, said, we will overturn Prop 8, and it will be sooner than you think, but it will not be done in mass movements. It will be one conversion at a time of us winning people over with our lives. And I think she was right.
And Aaron, if I could just say one thing
Sure.
about practical theology as a lens. Practical theology is an intentionality of looking at how we put into praxis, how we reflect upon, how we act upon our theological understanding. It's not about being practical or impractical, but is it a praxeological lens? Because we can sit and study and not critically reflect on, how do we actualize this through our behavior and our relationships with each other. In that vein, when I look at what's happening right now with Trump and these Black Lives Matter times, I see very much the enactment of what I call the lemming syndrome. The lemming is an animal that usually lives en masse, and for whatever phenomenon, if one starts running that way, they all start running that way and even follow each other off a cliff. We have got to ethically, theologically, critically think in a way that we are critically self-reflective about what we're doing and stop crowd following.
Differentiate.
Exactly, exactly. That is the only way that we will be able to break the syndrome. The thing that is troubling me right now, and I know we don't have time to deal with it, but all of you probably have seen, because it's circling through the social media, Andrea and I were talking about it, this recent thing just this week where these young kids wearing Make
Right.
America Great Again hats
Right.
That's what you're
Right, that's what we're talking about.
are
That's
coming
exactly right.
to, they're in an immersion trip on Native American land, and they are disrespectful to this elder and the rituals that the Native Americans are doing to welcome them. And now it's come out in response. Of course, the school has put up this rather empty apology, but now the parents are speaking out. And one of the mothers of the very visible kids in the video is saying, well, Native Americans are Muslims anyhow. I mean, when you have this kind of mentality,
right.
then I agree with Bishop Andrus. It's easy to say, oh my gosh, all is lost. But King is challenging us.
Right.
Womanist thinkers challenging us that we have to think about the commonweal, that the good of our community. So we cannot let the individual small-mindedness, the lemmings, stop our radical action for justice.
Yeah, and I think that's a place, these last two questions sort of merge into one, and they connect specifically with what you're talking about. And I think we'll end here. What are those, and Andrea, if you can start in 30 seconds, what are those places of connectedness and intersection between peoples that we can find sort of to help deal with some of these divides? The Bishop in his position, sitting and dealing honestly and straightforward with people who have very different ways of thinking and looking at things, but not masking those differences. What can come of that? You know, is it love? Is it hope? But where are these places of intersection and how that can be? I want to end there. We've got 2 minutes before the 6 o'clock. And 2 minutes between us for the 6 o'clock. So see
Okay.
if we can't cover some of that in 30 seconds or less.
I'm going to solve racism in 30 seconds or less.
Solve it all, the whole thing.
I think that our top of the list problem is our misunderstanding of difference,
Yep.
as overcoming difference means that difference is a problem because difference means opposite. And oppositional already is going to create an antagonistic relation, and we create hierarchies from difference. Difference is not a problem to be overcome. If we accept difference as constitutive of who we are,
Yeah.
as humanity, then difference will be embraced rather than be violently opposed. Yeah.
Dr. Miles-Trimble?
I'm going to pass to Bishop Andrus. Let me think about that.
Well, I'm going to quote from that amazing Nobel Prize speech of Dr. King's to underscore what you just said. Further on in the speech, he says this: when our days become dreary with low hovering clouds, and our nights become darker than 1,000 midnights, then we know that we are living in the creative tension of a genuine civilization struggling to be born. which is to say that it's not struggle that we want to overcome, but struggle is productive of the birth of something new, depending on how we approach it. And remember what he had lived through in 1963 before getting that prize in '64. That was just bring it to mind. What had happened in Birmingham, what had happened in Georgia, those things were on his mind and on his heart. And he could say that.
Thank you, Bishop.
I think that as King closed his letter in the Birmingham jail, and also a sermon that he was writing that he didn't get to preach before he was assassinated, it was interesting that he had a title already on an unfinished sermon, Why America Might Go to Hell. And that, again, to me, is a prophetic charge for us, that we have to be mindful of the direction that we're heading, the things that we are risking if we don't work towards love, justice, peace, harmony. The self-destruction that gets beyond our capability to pull back from is the biggest risk. And I think that's what he was trying to propel even in the South around the racism, to think about. By your trying to destroy a group of people, you are in fact destroying an infrastructure that you need for your very existence.
Wow, so a tipping point, really.
So we have to be mindful and be ever critical of where are we getting near that tipping point and point of no return. Because in order for us to really understand and go forward and say, how can we move forward together, we have to be careful not to cross that point.
Wow.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Right Reverend Mark Hanley Andrus, the Reverend Dr. Valerie Miles-Trimble, and the Reverend Dr. Andrea Christina White.
And
Aaron.
And
Dr. Aaron Grizzell in
the
formation.
Dr. Aaron Grizzell.
So, thank you so much. This concludes this forum. We will be back here next year. Lord say the same.